Lord, you are in the midst of the waves and the storm, that you're there with us. We are not in this alone. We have every reason to approach the throne of grace with confidence, thanks to you. Lord, thank you for your great grace and love in our lives, that we are not alone. We have each other in addition to your wonderful presence. So we give this time to you. Thank you that we can gather together, and we love you, Lord. Help us as we live our lives daily to reach out and to love. In Jesus' name, amen.
Several weeks ago, our family had the opportunity to travel to Missouri to go to the Lake of the Ozarks with some of our good friends. At various points in our vacation, I started to ask myself, can life get any better than this? In fact, one day we decided to rent a pontoon and go out on the lake and just have some fun. We toured around the lake for a while, and eventually we got to this beautiful, majestic cove. We said this is a great place to throw an anchor in and let the kids swim. And as the kids were jumping in, as we were jumping in, everybody was laughing and having an absolute blast. I thought, wow, life truly can't get any better than what we're experiencing now. Later on the trip, my wife made an observation. She saw these giant fish as she's looking out over the water, breaching the surface and then landing and splashing. And she looked and she said, hey guys, do you guys see that? And eventually, sure enough, we saw the same thing. We saw fish jumping out of the water. And so we started to do a little research, and I said, I wonder if those are paddlefish. And sure enough, I think they were. And basically, paddlefish are prehistoric freshwater swordfish that are living in this lake. That's not really true, but that's what it felt like to me. My wife commented, you know, when I think about that moment in that cove when we were out on the pontoon, it seemed really fun to swim. But now that I realize and I see that these fish are jumping out of the water, I'm not sure I feel the same way. And as a result, her comment reframed my understanding of the good life that I was observing at that moment when we were anchored in that bay. In thinking about my wife's comment, how was I supposed to interpret the life is good, knowing that giant sea creatures roamed beneath my feet? I have now discovered that these prehistoric fish do not actually eat people, which is great news. So feel free to go to the Lake of the Ozarks and go swimming. There might be other creatures, but the paddlefish are okay. In that illustration, it confirms something about our initial observations of the world. At first glance, we can judge something as good on the surface of our evaluation. However, my experience with swimming and gaining Kristen's perspectives reminds me that knowledge is limited, offering only a partial view of reality. Our observations can only take us so far because they are limited. This is most likely the reason why the preacher points out in 6:12, in the form of a question, he asks, who can know what is good? And that rhetorical question implies that ultimately, we can't really know what is good. And later we'll explore who can know what is good. But even if that's true, if nobody can ultimately know what is good, that doesn't mean that we can't live wisely and try to live a life that is good or a life that is better. In fact, Ecclesiastes 6:12 provides a backdrop for us as we get into the text of chapter 7, verses 1 through 14. And this is where we're going to study and we're going to explore in our message today. And even though we have limitations and blinders on in life, the preacher wants to help us to say, but we still need to live wisely, even though it is difficult to know what the good life is. So below the surface of a good life is realizing that there is a way of living that is better, is ultimately good. And so through that lens, we ask this important question, what is a good life? And from the preacher, who we assume is Solomon, we will learn a lot about the good and the better life. So as we learn about a good life, we turn our Bibles open to Ecclesiastes 7, 1 through 14, and we're going to look at three general sections. The first section are verses 1 through 4. The second section will be verses 5 through 10, and I'll warn you that there are just these slices of truth that we'll explore lots of stuff in quick succession in verses 5 through 10. A lot of great stuff. And then lastly, verses 11 through 14. So let's look at those first four verses. Ecclesiastes 7, 1 through 4 says, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth." Mirth means a house of celebration where there's singing and enjoying life. I love how wisdom literature forces us to think. As I read the first verse, I'm like, yep, I totally agree. A good reputation is way better than expensive cologne. In other words, I get it. I know I'm supposed to live my life in such a way to produce an understanding that I have lived well. That's the good reputation. And that's way more important than looking good, smelling good, or gathering possessions that show that I am a person of prestige or a person of importance. Rather, the reputation or what is said about me is far better. No disagreement. I fully understand. I fully agree. But when I keep reading, there's a sudden turn in the logic. The preacher says that death is better than life. What? He continues by stating that it's better to go to a house of mourning than it is to a party where there is singing and celebration and dancing and laughter. In fact, he says that it's better to cry than to laugh. When I read that, it makes very little sense. I want to call a big time out and say, based on my own experience, I typically think that it's the complete opposite. When I think about my life, I think that birth has to be far better than death. It is way better to laugh than it is to cry. And everybody knows it's way better to party with friends than to mourn with others. So why is viewing life's end better than looking at life's beginning? This is exactly what the preacher wants us to explore. And this is the power of wisdom literature. It makes us ask, what is going on in this text? David Gibson makes an incredible insight about the idea that death is better than birth. He says this: when we look at this passage, birth is about potential. It's about what we could be, not understanding and knowing what the future will be. But death is about fulfillment. It's about looking back and understanding what life has been. And when we look back, we can see where our life has gone, and we can start to think, oh, I built my reputation based on X, Y, and Z. I've done these things in my life, and this is now being said about me, or this will be said about me. The truth is that death has something to teach us about living a good life. Verse 2 says, "For this, death, is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart." In other words, the living should devote serious reflection on the reality of death. Death is a good teacher because it makes us think intentionally about our lives. It forces us to ask questions such as, what name am I building for myself? And what will others say about me when I die? And when we ask ourselves these questions, we start to be more intentional about how we live. When we say, what kind of name am I building for myself? We think, ooh, I should live in such a way that it produces that kind of outcome at the end of my life? And we can only do this through serious, intentional reflection that allows our thoughts to transform into actions, thus changing how we live. When we do this, we start to cultivate a life that honors God. We start to cultivate a righteous life, a life that God desires for us. When we do this, we start working on character and establishing values, the stuff that ultimately frames who we are as people at the end of our lives. You've heard the phrase, hindsight is 20/20. This passage is saying something similar. It is ultimately better to build your life by looking backwards than looking forward. Or to say it more clearly, the good life is found by looking backward rather than looking forward. Now, the preacher in these 4 verses has laid the foundation for discussing a good life that is grounded in the seriousness of life, looking at it from the end rather than the beginning. Now, this reminder creates a new lens by which we continue to apply wisdom to our lives. As we think about the end and as we think about how the end orients our lives in a serious and intentional way, we're in a position to live a good and better life. In fact, as we have seen already in these passages, and as we look to the next section, verses 5 through 10, we see this theme of a good and better life. And so even though we can't grasp or fully understand what the good life is, because there's things that operate below the surface and things that make things complex, that shouldn't stop us from attempting to live a good and wise life. The preacher isn't completely throwing stuff out the door. He's just saying, hey, it's hard to understand. It's hard to grasp. There are things below the surface that make it difficult to understand what a good life looks like. But there is value in living wisely. And so now we turn to the next section. And building off of this idea that the end is better than the beginning, we see a series of quick statements that help us live a better life. When we read verses 5 and 10, we see that these 5 keys to living wisely are something that speak to our hearts in personal ways, ultimately helping us reframe how we want to live for Jesus. Listen to Ecclesiastes 7, 5 through 6. It says, "It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This is also vanity." That term vanity has appeared often in the book of Ecclesiastes. When we read these verses, they point to a simple truth that appears elsewhere in the wisdom literature, especially in the book of Proverbs. This is what the preacher is saying in a nutshell. A sincere rebuke from a wise person is better than casual guidance from a fool. Now, as we look at verse 6 and we see this language of the crackling of thorns under a pot, we start to say, well, how is that related to rebuke and casual guidance from a fool, or the laughter of a fool? Commentator Jerry Shepard says this is imagery that helps us understand that these things can't do anything of great value. The laughter of a fool, the casual guidance of a fool cannot provide lasting substance. In fact, he says, these thorns under the pot produce more noise than substance. Thistles provide a quick flame, little heat, and a lot of unpleasant noise. And when I think about that statement and think about this verse, I can't help but from saying that's true. That the laughter of the fool and the casual guidance, the passive, unserious tone of being around somebody who could care less about you or life, it has no substance. It brings no long-term value, even though in the moment it seems fun and good, but it doesn't produce what it ought to. In fact, the opposite is true. A sincere rebuke from a wise person is way better. Way better. This passage convicts me, if I'm being brutally honest. It's way easier to surround myself with people that I can laugh with and keep conversation going with and be casual and lighthearted. But if I don't check my heart, I can use this as a form of avoidance or a form of escape, which allows me to build protective walls around me that keep me from hearing the kind of stuff that I ought to hear. It's hard. It's difficult to hear criticism. Why? Because that critique, that the rebuke of a wise person brings to us, often hits us right where it hurts. Hits us right with the way we're living our lives in terms of our attitudes and our behaviors. Hearing a rebuke isn't the most pleasurable experience. I think most of us would agree with that. The preacher says, but open yourself to rebuke from someone, especially someone who is wise, for this is a better way to live. It is better because a rebuke provides the listener with something of substance. In fact, Proverbs 28:23 reminds us that when someone rebukes us, they will one day be appreciated. Listen to the words of Proverbs 28:23. Whoever rebukes a man will afterward find favor than he who flatters with his tongue. Let me say that again. Whoever rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than he who flatters with his tongue. I think this observation is so true. While we might initially resist the criticism of someone, in time and through reflection, we will learn that they had something wise to say to us. And over time, as we reflect on the truthfulness of that statement, it will transform and change our lives, and we will begin to value the one who criticizes more. And as a result, we'll continue to probably go to them and say, "You spoke into my life in a valuable way. Would you be willing to do that again?" How about you? Have you surrounded yourself by people who will laugh with you and party with you and give you casual guidance? If you do, that's good. I'm not saying that's bad. I don't think that is what the preacher is trying to say. But if that's all you do, then you're not living a better life. Don't close yourself off from people who can offer you substance, something tangible that can help your life become better. Allow them to expose you to valuable insight that will help you live for God. Be wise. Hear the rebuke of a wise person. Moving on, we turn to verse 7. Verse 7 says, "Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and bribes corrupt the heart." In some translations, the word extortion is used instead of oppression. Both extortion and bribery are ways of controlling someone or being controlled by someone. There's both sides of the coin implied in this verse. In this verse, we learn something about the influence of extortion and bribery. As you're living your life trying to apply wisdom to it, it's possible that you can be corrupted, or it's possible that you can corrupt others. And so oppression, extortion, and bribery has a way of influencing or affecting the heart. And thus, if we're not careful, we become fools rather than the wise. In fact, I would say this: a wise person can be corrupted and corrupt others with money and possessions. When we think about oppression, when we think about extortion and bribery, we think about how money and possessions are often used to control others. If you don't do this, then I will withhold something from you, such as money. Or I'm going to use money or possessions as an advantage, to have advantage over somebody else, which is really the nature of a bribe. We must be constantly aware of the social power dynamics that exist in this world. Most of us intuitively understand that. We understand that bribery and oppression and extortion are not right, but we forget that they work in our lives in casual and subtle ways, influencing us. And if we're not careful, that power balance that we have in life can be used for good and for evil. I like what Proverbs 19:6 says. Many seek the favor of a generous man, and everyone is a friend to a man who gives. Isn't this true? That there's something that draws people to money and to generosity. It is not bad to be wealthy. It is not bad to be generous. But we know that there are challenges that we experience when it comes to wealth and it comes to power. Many put themselves in positions to benefit from the wealthy, but doing so, this comes with great risks. Where power and money exist, so does the possibility of oppression. Both the poor and the rich should consider this. It is unwise to live a life that is prone to oppression, extortion, and bribes. The wise will take this into consideration and protect themselves from falling into this trap. Moving on, in verse 8, it said, better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. This theme of the end and beginning sort of reoccurs here as it did in the first 4 verses, but then it adds the whole idea of patience and pride in this section. Well, what are they talking about? What is this whole idea of patience and pride? And how does it relate to the beginning and the end? I think this is another creative way of saying patiently let things play out rather than be overly confident of how things will turn out. A different way to say it is that if you are proud and you think, oh, I'm going to know how everything is going to go and I can control that, you are out of your mind. Instead, we must be patient and be humble and let that situation play out, allowing God to work in the midst of it, bringing about the kind of results that He wants to bring. We're going to look at this idea a little bit more at the very end of today's message. But for now, it makes me think of my own life. I know this experience. As I was writing this statement in my notes, I started thinking about our family nights when we play games. Now, if anybody has played games with me, and my family would surely know this, I'm the kind of person who feels pretty confident about how a game will go because of my track record. Even right now, as I say that, I feel a little sense of pride. Games like Catan or a new game that we've playing, the Century Golem, I feel confident that I will come out as the victor. And so with that in mind, I like to tell my family or remind them that, you know what, it's probably not even worth playing because I already know how this is going to go. You know, most of the time, everybody gets a laugh out of it because the truth is I don't always win, and my overconfidence and my pride is put to the challenge. But in that illustration, we're reminded of that great truth. It is way better to let things patiently play out than to be overly confident in trying to control how things will turn out. The reality is the wise will see right through pride, and they'll see right through that impatience, and they will sit back and say, you know what? I am comfortable letting God be in control, and things will play out as He desires and as He wills. In fact, when we get to the book of James and we read through chapter 4, verses 13 through 7, we see a couple of businessmen who think that they're going to go into town and they're going to get rich because they understand that they can control their future and there's a lot of opportunity. There is an evil arrogance to this thinking, that we can work everything out before we even start. In fact, the challenge in the book of James is that remember that your life is just a snap of the fingers. It is just a mere vapor. Before you can think about it, it is gone. And so don't think that you can go into some place and at some time and in some situation and think that you can completely understand and have it all figured out, or that you can control it with a sense of pride, because we can't. Always remember that your future is unknown and that your life is subject to the will of God. As I continue to read through these words in the book of Ecclesiastes, I sort of wondered to myself, is James a big reader of Ecclesiastes? Is this his favorite book? Because this isn't the only place where we can find a parallel between Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and the book of James. In fact, when we read Ecclesiastes 7:9, we will hear words that almost sound identical to James chapter 1. Verse 9 says this, "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." Listen to James 1:19. This is something you've probably heard before. Maybe you've even read it because this is something that you're working on in your life. James 1:19 says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." In both passages, we are warned to heed the words of the wise. Remain calm and avoid overreacting in anger. Don't be quick to being angry. In fact, if we're looking at these passages, specifically Ecclesiastes 7:9, you're considered a fool if you're quickly angered or if you're easily angered. At this point, you can see the flow of the logic racing through the preacher's mind. He is connecting patience and anger. On one hand, in the previous verse, we have patience. Here in the second verse, there's a focus on quick anger. Wisdom says if you are patient, you will be less likely to react in anger. Is it a coincidence that angry people are often impatient people? Or that impatient people are often angry people? James says that one of the secrets to working on patience and anger is listening and being quiet. Now, this is a great exercise and a great practice. If you find yourself getting impatient and your anger meter is rising, wisely choose to be silent and commit to hearing what someone else has to say. Doing so will keep you from becoming a fool and keep you from causing damage in your relationships. Many people have had to learn this lesson the hard way. And as their words have gone out and as they've done damage, they realize that quick anger leads to quick words, and those quick words lead to quick damage. And so we must stop, get control of our anger, and think before we speak. This is what it means to be wise. Only fools are quick to being angry. Lastly, in this little section of these key little insights of wisdom, the preacher offers one last brief statement before making general comments about the importance of living a good life and pursuing wisdom. In Ecclesiastes 7:10, it says this, "Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." In short, stop telling yourself that the past was better. For whatever reason, I think this was probably one of the most powerful statements of the passage that I looked at and explored. And maybe it's just because of the moment of history that we're living in. The past seems so much better than it does right now. I remember when we could walk around in public without fear of being infected with COVID or infecting others with COVID. I didn't have to worry about what I'm going to do with my kids if there's no school. I just send them on their way, and they have their opportunity to be with friends, and more importantly, to learn and to grow as human beings. But now I have to think, what does that look like in today's reality, in light of our historic situation? I didn't have to ponder how we could worship together, study together, grow together, and participate in mission together because it was just easier to be together in the body of Christ. That temptation to think that life was better back then several months ago is so high because I'm constantly weighing that past experience to my present experience. The preacher says that nostalgia or being nostalgic is not helpful. You should not ask the question, or we should not be asking, why were the former days better than these? Because it is not from a place of wisdom that we ask these things. The reason why we should not be thinking too much about the past is implied in the statement. The past history is not the ideal. While we should appreciate the past, we should remember that the past is just as complicated as the present. I'm not sure why we forget this, but it is true. Life wasn't easier before COVID. There were just as many issues and concerns going on. It wasn't about COVID and infections and pandemics, but there were other things going on in my life and in the world that somehow have gotten drowned out as a result of what's going on in this present moment. While we should appreciate the past, like I said, we should remember that the past was just as complicated. The truth is, if you stop and think about it, the past probably isn't as great as your mind was telling you. Is this true? When you think about your past and you think about the good old days, have you ever stopped to think about all the other stuff that was going on in your life or in someone else's life? And the truth is, there probably was just as many hardships or different kinds of hardships in your life. And the preacher in Ecclesiastes is reminding us of that. I like how David Gibson says, if you believe that the past was better, you might be denying the reality of God's presence in the present. I need to say that again. Dave Gibson in his commentary says, if you believe that the past was better, you actually might be denying the reality of God's presence in the present. He goes on to say, if you think things are worse, do you think God is no longer in control? Do you think He hasn't brought you to the point of where you are now and that He no longer loves you or has plans and purposes for you? See, that the reality is when we think that the past was better than the present, we think that God was more with us then than He is with us now, but that is completely not true according to the wisdom of Ecclesiastes. In fact, if you are prone to thinking that things aren't as good as they used to be, I encourage you to drop this language completely from your vocabulary and replace it with a deep appreciation that God is present with you in this moment. And in this moment of history, God is with us. And as a result, we can be fully present and fully trusting of God, here and now. Let me unpack this a little bit more. Let me show you that there is something here that has to be speaking into our lives, because I think this is something that we are all incredibly guilty of. When we realize that God is here and now, we put our trust in Him, not only for the present moment, but also for the future. This is something that needs to be a part of our perspective. And for those who have placed their trust in Jesus, and as we think about the present, God being present here, and we think about the future, we know that those who have placed their trust in Jesus and have believed in what Jesus has done through His death and resurrection and what He's done for forgiveness of sin, we can add hope to our current situation. And so in God's presence here and through faith in Jesus Christ and what He has done for us, we can add hope as we look to the future to our thoughts. As a reminder, a huge reminder, let's stop thinking that the past was so much better. Let's praise God that He is with us here and now. And let's praise Him that we understand our destination and where we're going as followers of Jesus. If we do this, we will live wisely and we will live lives that honor Jesus. The last section, Ecclesiastes 7:11 through 14, says this: wisdom is good with an inheritance and advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. We'll slow down and read this next section. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider God has made one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. We can summarize the section with the following statement. It is good to live wisely, but even better to trust God in the uncertainty of life. There are benefits to wisdom, as we have discussed throughout this passage, and yes, we should pursue those things, but we must understand that wisdom only takes us so far. Verse 13 reminds us that there is a mysteriousness to God and His plan for us. The rhetorical question about making straight the work of God is clear. We are not God. We are powerless to change what God is doing in our lives. There's nothing that we can do to affect the word of God, or the work of God in our lives. Who can make straight what He has made crooked? Zach Eswine says that the reading of the book of Ecclesiastes is like walking around a creepy basement with a flashlight. I love that imagery, by the way. The preacher has been walking around shedding light on the awkward and painful realities of life where selfish indulgence takes place, where greed, bitterness, oppression, anger, injustice, and so forth exists. But we're trying to live wisely in that moment as we experience all these things. It's like a flashlight being shining on these things and saying, hey, let's expose that. That's not right. We should think about a better way to live. But then at the end of this passage, we get perspective. And where that creepy old basement starts to be exposed, and we start to understand what's actually going on in there. And yes, while it's hard to admit, we have made many observations about life. Life is like a creepy basement that we walk around and we're shedding light on these things. But we need to remember these last few verses in this book. As we think about the work of God in our lives, we understand that there is a reality that God is at work in this moment, and He is working out His plan and His purposes. This is the good news that the preacher is trying to tell us. Even though you're walking around in a creepy, dark basement with a flashlight, all is not lost. You are not lost. We are not lost. He brings all observations into the focus in verse 14, where he sheds ultimate light on things, and he says, God is in the middle of all of this. You can see clearly because God is present and He's in the middle of all of it. The preacher ends by saying some profound words. Whether you are experiencing seasons of joy or seasons of struggle, whether you are experiencing seasons of greatness or seasons of depression, seasons of great success or seasons of major adversity, God is present in all of those things, and all of those things are under the sovereign control of God. Here's the truth that we need to hear as we think about the reality of a world that is fractured and broken. He is present in that reality as much as He is present in the reality of life when things are going well. Now, as we think about these things, we summarize by saying this. It is ultimately good to live wisely. But even living wisely, it is difficult for us to understand anything and everything around us, especially when we see brokenness, hardship, and heartache. But in the midst of this, we understand that God has all things under His control. All things are under His care. And so as you today seek to live the wise, the good, and the better life, our prayer for you is that you would remember that God is with you here and now, helping you to live more wisely, helping you to orient your life in such a way that you are building a good reputation, helping you to understand that it is better to be patient than proud, better for you to be quiet rather than angry, helping you to not be influenced by bribery and extortion, helping you to understand that it's not good to be nostalgic, but to appreciate that He is with you in this moment. And so today, we leave this place understanding this perspective, and as a result, we're able to live a good and a better life under the sun. Next week, in the near future, we'll be looking at Ecclesiastes. I look forward to hearing what Danny will continue to say as he shares with us. But until then, we leave you with this statement: God is able, and we are sent.